Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today as we host our special guest, Dr. Brett Belchetz, CEO and co-founder of Maple, for a discussion on how to best manage stress and anxiety during COVID-19. Dr. Belchetz is the CEO and co-founder of Maple, Canada's leading virtual care provider, connecting patients and healthcare providers like doctors, dermatologists, and therapists for online medical visits. He's also a practicing physician in Toronto and a senior fellow at the Fraser Institute. In addition, Brett's passion for healthcare communication and policy have led him to work as an on-air medical expert for CTV and Global News, as well as a contributor to outlets such as the National Post. Here are some quick housekeeping rules. Please make sure to keep your mics muted throughout the presentation, but feel free to ask any questions you may have in the chat box at the bottom of your screen. We'll also open up an audience Q&A at the end of this event. So thank you so much for your time today, Dr. Belchetz, and take it away.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for the introduction, and thank you to everybody who is tuning in today. It's wonderful to be able to speak to you today, and I really am appreciative of your time, especially over what is probably lunchtime hour for many of you. This is a topic today that I think is really important and very topical, given I think what we're seeing across Canada and around the world relating to stress and anxiety and just all of the difficulties that I think many people are having dealing with the pandemic, dealing with pre-existing challenges in their life, et cetera. So really important, I think, to understand what people are going through and how people can maybe more effectively deal with these issues in these difficult times. So I have a little presentation that I'm going to take you through. So bear with me for one moment while I get this presentation up. And hopefully you guys are seeing the presentation now. And if anybody's not seeing the presentation, if somebody jumps in and just lets me know, but I'll jump in from here. So just going through the things that I wanted to talk about today are a few different topics related to this overarching idea of managing stress and anxiety, and specifically just talking about what have we seen so far in 2020. How is this actually impacting people's mental health here in Canada? There's some pretty profound stats that just show how much of a big issue this is. Really helping people to understand what are stress and anxiety. And a lot of the time, stress and anxiety do not manifest the way that we classically believe that they would manifest. So important to understand and recognize the symptoms. Understand what you can do to manage it without leaving your home, because during this difficult time, I think one of the things that many people are not doing is leaving their home. Most people are managing very much a huge percentage of their life from home. So being able to deal with this without leaving home is obviously critical right now. And then, just discuss some of the benefits of even outside of a pandemic, accessing care digitally and virtually through many of the tools that are available now versus managing in person. So I'll jump in from there and just talk about a little bit about what we've been seeing in 2020. So I don't think this is a surprise to anybody that is tuning in today. I think we all have had numerous stresses that have affected us over the course of this year. So the number one thing, I think we've all seen is obviously COVID-19. And I think there's not a person that I speak to, no matter what their job is, no matter where they live, that has not had some effect on their mental health as a result of the fear of infection, the fear of getting sick, the fear of loved ones getting sick, the social isolation, the change in our overall environment, the economic anxiety that's related to the fact that many jobs are being lost. I think there's just an overarching sense of gloom and worry, I think, that has encompassed almost everybody. Lots of other things have happened all at the same time. So lots of stressful occurrences around social justice or social injustice. We've seen civil unrest. We've seen police brutality. We've seen many of these things reach a point which is certainly contributed, I think, very significantly on top of the pandemic to make people have, even more worry. I've mentioned, obviously economic anxiety. And again, the same thing, in our third bullet here is around this financial crisis, but just doubling down on that almost on its own point. I think having the fear of job loss on top of the fear of infection is certainly something which is really a phenomenon that we haven't seen, at least in most of our lives before. If you are somebody that lives more on the West Coast or anywhere close to the West Coast, There's the wildfires that were spreading there. People that I know that live in Vancouver were dealing with smoke for as far as they could see for weeks on end, not that long ago. And again, that just adds to the sense of gloom and anxiety, and certainly takes people's mental health to a lower level. We've seen things like disasters in other parts of the world, in Beirut. Everybody I speak to, even here in Canada, is looking at this United States election and wondering what is going to happen. I think there's a lot of fear over, depending on your sense of politics, a lot of fear over what that outcome is going to mean for either friends or family in the United States, for their businesses, for Canada as a whole, given how close our relationship is with the United States. So overall, we look at this year, and it's hard to imagine that anybody's mental health could actually not be profoundly affected as a result of all these challenges. And so I wanted to start the presentation with this, and start with the really difficult thing, because I think, the good thing is that there's a lot of good things that we can follow up with. So this is the tough stuff. From here, I really want to move on to, what are at least some of the good things. And I will get a little bit more detailed on the difficult things first, but I just want to say that definitely, while this is really gloomy, we're going to go in a better direction from here as we chat more. So just wanted to personalize this a little bit in terms of some of the headlines we've been seeing. So it's one thing just to speak about these as greater topics, but you start to see that just the human toll that all of these things are taking. So the bottom left one is something that resonated very personally with me, and this is not the only case of this. So seeing examples of physicians who are suiciding as a result of all of the stress of taking care of patients during the pandemic. And I can speak as a physician that being a healthcare provider, and it doesn't matter if you're a physician, a paramedic, a nurse, a respiratory therapist, all of us have dealt with incredible levels of stress throughout the pandemic, a fear of personal safety and personal health. And I think this is not unique even to people who work in the front lines of health. This is anybody who works in the front lines of almost any profession. If you spoke to people that worked in grocery stores, they had a lot of anxiety every time they had to go to work in the early days of the pandemic before appropriate protections were brought in. And even still, there's a lot of fear. You have headlines around, very specific things like COVID-19 stress disorder, something that we've started to realize in medical journals. Overall, we're starting to see increases in things like depression, suicides, opioid overdoses. All of these are going up. Erosions in mental health, suicides in other parts of the country. So, the headlines, and this is just a selection, the headlines, I think, routinely personalize this and show that this is not just something that, we put on a bunch of bullet points. The real human toll that this is taking on people is very, very real and very much accumulating over time. So looking at what's happening here in Canada, it is helpful to look at the stats for Canada and understand how this is affecting Canadians. And it is an easy thing to sort of say, I've been okay, or I've only been affected a little bit, and to think like this isn't as big of a problem in Canada, potentially maybe because our numbers weren't as bad in the early days, or our economy maybe is not as badly affected as some other parts of the world. But in fact, this is affecting Canadians to a very, very profound degree. So we've seen that almost half of Canadians have been feeling anxious or worried, and this was a set of surveys that was done in May of this year, but this has not markedly changed over the course of the year. I think COVID-19 has dramatically increased the percentage of Canadians who feel this way, anxious or worried. And if we were to survey this in any other era, this would have been a dramatically lower number. We're seeing more than a third of Canadians reporting that their mental health has actually declined as a result of COVID. So specifically as a result of COVID. So this is a massive number, saying 1/3 of our overall population feels that their mental health is going downhill. And this is only the people that recognize that their mental health is going downhill. So there's a really important thing to note here, that many people whose mental health is going downhill actually don't even realize that this is what's happening. There are other symptoms of that decline in mental health that they may be writing off to other things in their life. And we'll get a little bit later into my presentation, we'll get a little bit into the symptoms of mental health decline, but many, many people actually do not have these classic symptoms of worry, anxiety, et cetera. So this probably dramatically underestimates just how much of an effect we've had on people's mental health. Lots of people are reporting that they're failing to cope. So almost 15% of Canadians have reported that they've had trouble coping with COVID-19 as a phenomenon. And I would actually imagine this is May of 2020 that this stat came in. And just from my anecdotal experience, speaking to patients, speaking to colleagues, speaking to family, speaking to friends, what I hear is many people who actually felt okay in May, people who said, it's fine because we can do this for a few months. Many of them are not feeling okay anymore, because 6-7 months later, where we've gotten to a point where nothing has really gotten better. We don't yet have a vaccine. We still have lockdowns. Case numbers, while they went down for a short period of time, have gone right back up. There are many people I have spoken to who said, I was coping just fine, but I've kind of reached my limit. I just can't go on any longer like this. This is one of the scariest stats of all, is the one on the right, which is that we're seeing a very significant percentage of Canadians, so 2%, which is 1 in every 50 Canadians, are saying that they've tried to harm themselves in response to COVID. And that is just a terrifying and an awful statistic. So for any one of us, if we were to think about our extended network of friends and family, most of us have a couple hundred people. And what this means is if you've got a network of a couple hundred people in your, that friends and family, the odds say if they look like the average group of Canadians, 4 people within your network may have tried to harm themselves in response to COVID. And that is alarming. That is far more than we would typically see. And this is something that we absolutely need to be concerned about. And one of the other things that I think we wanted to flag here and that I wanted to talk about is people aren't seeking help the way that they normally would seek help. And that's what that leftmost stat that you see on this slide speaks about. So we've seen very significant reductions into visits in the emergency room, but not only visits in the emergency room, visits in all areas of our healthcare system. So visits to people's family doctors, visits to their in-person therapists, et cetera. We've seen that people have been afraid to seek help. They've been afraid to seek help because they're locked down, they fear infection, or any other number of things that might be making them not go out for help. But certainly with all of these horrible things happening across the country and all of this incredible level of anxiety, it is very worrisome that people aren't actually going out and getting the help that they need. So really important, I think, to highlight what anxiety and stress looks like and how to identify it in yourself. So one of the biggest misconceptions that I often see as a physician is that most people, when you tell them that they have anxiety disorder or you tell them that they're suffering from anxiety attacks, the most common thing my patients will say to me is, there's no way it's anxiety attacks, or there's no way I have anxiety disorder because I don't feel anxious. Almost every patient routinely says to me, I don't feel anxious. And so one of the misconceptions that I always want to dispel around anxiety disorder, around anxiety attacks, is that a lot of the time anxiety is actually not the main presenting symptom. Most of what we see from anxiety disorder and anxiety attacks is actually the physical effects on your body of anxiety that actually is existing at more of a subconscious level that you may not even be aware of. And a lot of the time, for many people, these are the only symptoms that you're going to see. And so I wanted to speak to that because it's really important, because there are many people out there that may have other symptoms who are suffering and don't even realize what it is that they're suffering from. It's also really important to separate anxiety disorder from anxiety attacks. So again, these are very, very different entities. Anxiety disorder is typically something that is an ongoing disorder that people suffer from on an ongoing basis, day in and day out, most of the time in their lives. Whereas anxiety attacks are much more, or we also call them panic attacks. These are very short-lived episodes where people, for a very short period of time, experience very, very intense symptoms. And actually, people who experience anxiety attacks may not necessarily have anxiety disorder, and people who experience anxiety attacks may feel perfectly fine outside of the times that they're experiencing anxiety attacks. So really important to separate these two, but just running through some of the symptoms, they each have some physical symptoms and they each have some psychological symptoms. So just to list a few, when we look at something like anxiety disorder, which is this pervasive feeling that people have that may be as a result of anxiety, there's a number of things that people don't typically think of as being caused by anxiety. So I think we all recognize, of course, that headaches come from anxiety. I think most of us have experienced worsening headaches in a time of worse anxiety. Things like gastrointestinal upset, diarrhea, et cetera, that is actually a very common symptom on an ongoing basis if you suffer from anxiety disorder. Sleep disturbance, so insomnia, is actually one of the very common presentations. And we've seen an overwhelming level of this during COVID, where people are waking throughout the night, they're struggling to fall asleep, et cetera. All of these are very common. Things like feeling dizzy, muscle tension, I think, is one of those things that people recognize typically can come from anxiety. So feeling pain in your neck, your back, actually having trembling limbs, all of these can actually come from anxiety disorder. The other things that we often see as well are the psychological symptoms. So those people who have pervasive underlying anxiety, a lot of the time, the big manifestation is that they can't concentrate. There is this classic idea of feeling nervous or tense, but that is not always there. You can be irritable. One of the main manifestations is just that you don't have the temper that you normally have. You don't have patience for either your children, your family members. And then there's just this general sense of impending danger or impending doom, which I think during the pandemic, I think many of us have that just as a result of events that are happening in the world. So if you were to go through this list of criteria, in fact, I would actually say that there's a very significant percentage of Canadians that are suffering from some of these symptoms as they work their way through this pandemic. Anxiety attacks are a little bit different. So this is, again, this very short-lived, intense episode that people have where they'll have that feeling of heart palpitations, they can have numbness or tingling in their limbs, they can have chest pain, dizziness, shortness of breath, like feeling that they're about to, this impending feeling that they may actually be about to die. Sometimes people feel that they're choking, they're shaky, and all of this comes on very suddenly and can be very intensely there for minutes to sometimes up to hours. One of the big things with anxiety attacks that I always say to anybody is if you have these kinds of symptoms, it is really important to, if it's the first time you've ever experienced this, to seek emergency care. Because even as a physician, when I'm treating you in the emergency room, it's impossible for me just looking at you and speaking to you to know whether your chest pain is due to an anxiety attack or if it's actually a heart attack. So you always want to seek emergency care if you have these kinds of symptoms. But for people that routinely get this and they know their symptoms and they've been checked out and they've had a clean bill of health, that it's not a heart attack, there's nothing wrong with their heart, their lungs, or any other organs, and it has been properly diagnosed by physicians as anxiety, these can be debilitating things that really do require attention and management. So I'll jump to the next thing, which is, when do you need to ask for help? So I've spoken a lot about the fact that so many people are having these issues right now. I think a lot of you out there might be wondering, okay, I've had one or two of these, but do I actually need to get help, or is this something that I can leave alone? And so what I always look at is it actually interfering with your life? Is it interfering with your ability to make it through your days, to function in your job, to function in your family, to function with your friends? If you find that you're doing great at work, your relationships are not affected, your friendships are not affected, your family life is good, most of the time you're probably okay. But these things are all the things to look out for. So, are you worried so much that it's interrupting your life, that you're not able to do the things that you would want to do if not for that worry? Are you too exhausted to carry out your day-to-day activities? Are you actually neglecting obligations in either your career or with your family or even with your friends? Are there things that you enjoy that you've stopped doing? And obviously, in COVID, there are many things that we've stopped doing because physically we can't do them. But are there actually activities like reading a book or playing an instrument, things that you absolutely could do, but you've just stopped doing them, and there isn't a clear reason why you've stopped doing them? Do you have feelings of isolation? Are you unable to leave home? And obviously, again, during COVID, there's not a lot of places to go, but there are many people who are so anxious or suffer so much from anxiety disorder that even despite the fact that they could go out their door and go for a walk, they just don't do it. They feel unable to do so. Are you actually aware that you have anxiety symptoms? So for those people that actually can identify that they have anxiety and worry, is it something that's just not going away after a few days? So anxiety for a day or two that goes away and is managed with normal activity, that's okay. But if you have these kinds of symptoms that after a few days, it's just not going away, again, that's concerning. The bottom one's a little bit vague, this idea that suspecting something is off. But again, that is a recognition when you suspect something is off. That's a recognition on your part that the way that your body and your mind are working is just not quite right. And so when you start to feel that way, that is your body and your mind saying to you, this is when you should seek help. So as I said, overall, the big thing here is this interfering with your life on any level of the activities that you have in your life? And if so, this is when you want to ask for help. So there's lots that you can do. And this is the good news. So this is, the thing that I think a lot of people who have these issues really need to start looking at, which is in this era of COVID, when it's so hard to leave home, when it's so hard to get help, what are the things that I can do to make a difference? So obviously first step, top left, is, speaking to others and being open about the fact that you have an issue. And either it's going to be speaking to your friends or your family members, or it's speaking to therapists or other professionals. But the key is, it's very, very difficult to manage many of these symptoms if you hold it all inside. So the first step in unburdening yourself is being willing to be transparent about the symptoms you're having and to ask for help. One of the greatest natural remedies is exercise. Really difficult, obviously, to do sometimes during COVID with gyms closing down for many of us where we live. Very difficult to do, especially as the weather gets colder. But there are many, many things that you can do even indoors. So, even if you tune into YouTube, there's hundreds and hundreds of amazing videos that will show you how to exercise in your living room. You don't need a lot of space. You don't need a lot of specialized equipment. So whatever it is that you're able to do, if you have access to a treadmill or a bicycle, or you need to do those kinds of YouTube workouts, all of this has been proven to make an incredible difference. Just 15 minutes of exercise a few times a week makes an incredible difference to people's mental health. When I say stay on top of your health, that's not just staying on top of your mental health, but it's staying on top of all of your health. Make sure that you're taking your medications that you take normally regularly. Make sure that if you have regularly scheduled checkups with your family doctor or other types of healthcare providers, make sure that you keep having those appointments. Either, if you're not able to do it in person, make sure that you do them virtually. If you neglect any part of your health, all of the other parts of your health tend to suffer. Big thing here, caffeine and alcohol. And I think many people tend to self-medicate with these. So many people, especially around alcohol, if their moods are off, if they're anxious, they find that if they have a drink or two, it can help with their mood. It can help with their anxiety. It can help them to fall asleep. The problem is this is a very short-term Band-Aid. And what we actually find is that people who are having alcohol regularly as a way of self-medicating actually end up having worse symptoms of all of these issues. So alcohol, the net effect is to worsen your mood. The net effect is to worsen your sleep. It causes more insomnia, et cetera. So if you can cut down alcohol, really important. And caffeine as well is really important. So having lots of caffeine to stay awake because you're sleep disturbed is actually a potent trigger of anxiety. The more caffeine being a stimulant that's in your system, the more likely you are to feel jittery, to feel anxious, to have many of these other symptoms that we've spoken around. And caffeine is also very much a stimulant or a trigger for panic attacks for those people that suffer from them. Relaxation techniques are really, really important for anybody that is having circulating thoughts, anxious thoughts, or any of those other manifestations we've spoken about. And there's lots of great tips on how to do these from home. You don't need to have a therapist that teaches you how to practice relaxation techniques. And this actually takes me to the next point, which is we're lucky that we live in a world where there are lots of apps that you can use at home that actually can help walk you through how to actually use relaxation and even meditation techniques. So things like the Headspace app is one that I recommend. There are many other apps that may be to your particular liking, but the good thing is we live in this amazing era where these are available and they're being shown to be very effective. There's lots of other online therapy tools, things like ICBT. If you Google that, these are things that are available online that again can be very helpful. Bottom left, easier said than done, getting enough sleep. But if you are sleep deprived and it's not something that is happening out of your control, so if you yourself are staying up very late or you're waking yourself up too early, you're doing things intentionally that are interrupting your sleep, really important not to do that. Also really important to make sure you have a healthy sleep environment. So really good blackout curtains, a quiet environment, make sure that the room is not too hot. People tend to sleep better in a cool environment. Finally, for those people who are having extreme difficulties, there are lots of helplines available across the country. In Toronto, where I live, there are many, many helplines available. Don't hesitate to call services that you can telephone into because a lot of them are fantastic navigators of understanding what your issue is and what the right next step is for you. And also, the number one thing that they provide, especially for people who are very isolated, is they provide a voice at the other end of the line for you to speak to, especially if you're suffering from isolation. A few other things. So just one of the things that's really important, and this gets into this idea of virtual care. So for all of those people that have been struggling to access care in person, unwilling to go to see a doctor at the emergency room or their family doctor or their therapist, virtual care is something that has really emerged as a saving grace for healthcare in Canada as part of the pandemic. And it's amazing the extent to which virtual care has really stepped in to help Canadians continue to access care. So pretty phenomenally, if we look at April, and I don't have stats for more recently, but in April, 70% of all healthcare visits in Canada were actually done virtually by phone or video or secure messaging. And these actually work. So almost 9 out of 10 patients who access their healthcare this way were satisfied with their visits. If we look at physicians, they have far more favorable viewpoints of virtual care and seeing patients online than they ever did before. And patients themselves are far more comfortable. So before the pandemic, many patients had never sought their healthcare online. They didn't know if it was safe. They didn't know if it worked. But now after the pandemic, you have almost 2/3 of Canadians saying they are actually much more comfortable accessing their healthcare online. So this is a great way for anybody who is suffering from any of these symptoms to get help without leaving their living room, without being exposed to all of the things that they're concerned about when they go into a doctor or therapist's office. So some of the benefits of this on the right side, just in terms of what we think about when we think about why virtual care is good for many of the issues during the pandemic, obviously greater safety from infection, not having to go into a waiting room, the ability to live share records between doctors or other healthcare providers. So one of the nice things in virtual care is you actually have a record from your care that belongs to you, that is shared between different providers you see. And if you see a therapist, they can see your doctor records and vice versa. There's a lot of extra confidentiality. So a lot of the time what we see is people who are afraid to seek help for mental health issues because they don't want to be seen in the waiting room at the therapist's office or at the psychiatrist's office. And the really nice thing about virtual care is that you don't have to worry about that. You never have to worry about somebody seeing you as the person that's walking into that therapy office or psychiatry office or in the waiting room. None of that sort of embarrassment factor that prevents a lot of people from seeking care. None of that exists in the virtual world. There's also increased access to care for people who are in rural and remote communities. And this is a really important thing. So those of us who, like me, live in the center of Toronto, we've got tons of access to resources. There's a therapist on every corner. There's a doctor on every corner. There's a psychiatrist, several blocks away in any direction that I look. But if you live in a rural part of Ontario or a rural part of Canada, that's just not the case. And many people in many parts of the country are hundreds of kilometers away from even the nearest general practitioner, let alone a therapist or a psychiatrist. So the nice thing about these virtual modalities of care is that they allow this kind of access equally for people across the country. And then, on that same point, it really allows us to take the very great access that we have in terms of specialist and mental health care that's available in urban cores, and it allows us to spread it more evenly across provinces and across rural areas. So it's a really great way to take advantage of all those resources that are in our system. So just jumping into the conclusion, I know that we're sort of about almost a half hour in, so happy and excited to take your questions. But the big things that we just wanted to get across today is just recognizing how big of an issue this is here in Canada. In 2020, we are seeing levels of stress and anxiety unlike anything we've ever seen before. And we're seeing terrible consequences, increase in self-harm and suicidality, and really just this is a crisis that it's important for everybody to be aware of and to be addressing. But secondly, I think the other big thing is that it's really critical to know that stress and anxiety don't always manifest with classic symptoms of stress and anxiety. And it's really important to know what the symptoms are of stress and anxiety and to address them early, because typically what we see is those people who ignore those symptoms, they don't get better on their own. They typically only get worse. And then the final thing that I really wanted to get across is that, this is not all hopeless. There's incredible tools out there. There's lots of things that you can do from home if you are suffering that can help you get through this. You're not alone. There are amazing tools and they're available for you right now. So that's all I have for you today. Really wanted to thank all of you for your time today, and especially your time over lunch hour, and happy to answer any questions that people may have.
Thank you. This was amazing. I'll jump in with a question. What have you done in the last, since March to kind of change your way of handling anxiety and everything? Like, what do you think that's kind of shifted on your end, or that you've really been focusing on?
That's a great question. So for me, I've been somebody who absolutely has been affected by this pandemic. I'm somebody who ordinarily never gets anxious and never feels stress and never worries about the world. And I can say that this is something that on a day-to-day basis is something that was concerning me as we've gone through these last few months. And so it was really important for me to recognize that as a result of what was happening in this world, I was not at my baseline. And so I made a number of adjustments. So I did a lot of the things that we spoke about in this presentation. So in the early days of the pandemic, I generally am somebody that loves wine. I'm a wine aficionado. And I noticed that we were starting to open a bottle of wine every single day. And that's not a good thing. And so, making that recognition to say this is a direction which is, almost self-medicating is not where we want to go. So made the conscious decision to really cut back and stop drinking alcohol almost at all. And that actually made a tremendous help. It helped in terms of the sleep that I was having and the way that I was feeling in general. That was number one. Number two, the recognition that for the first few months of the pandemic, again, I'm somebody that's normally very physically active, that I was not being physically active at all. I wasn't going to the gym. I wasn't running. I wasn't doing any of my workouts that I normally would do. So the other thing that was really helpful was emptying out part of my apartment to make room to be able to do workouts. So clearing a bunch of furniture away, starting to actually invest in some very basic home fitness equipment, and actually doing things like YouTube workouts and all the things that I spoke about, and doing those regularly and doing them almost every single day. And that's made a tremendous difference as well. And then finally, just eating healthy. So I think, ordinarily in the old world where I'd eat fast food for a lot of my meals because I was on the go, now one of the silver linings of the cloud of the pandemic is that we're all at home, working from home, at least those of us that are working at home. And when you work from home, you can actually work with fresh ingredients and have good, healthy food. And so really spent a lot of time and effort on having a lot of healthy eating. And so I think that combination of healthy eating, decreased alcohol, regular exercise. I think all of those have made a tremendous difference, at least in my day-to-day routines, to get through this.
Right. I agree. I mean, when the pandemic first started, we were all jumping on calls with our friends and not realize how much we were drinking. So, just cutting back and just realizing how much you're taking on a daily basis just makes such a difference. So, thank you. I have a couple questions that just came through here. So, is from Stacy, is there any indication that the government will move towards supporting online care?
There are some great indications, and we've already seen a lot of movement on the part of the government to fund things like online physician care. So there are temporary billing codes that have been introduced across most of the country that will now pay for physicians to treat patients online. One of our hopes, in terms of the company that I run, Maple, where we provide online care, one of our hopes is that this coverage goes from being temporary to being permanent, because there's so many amazing things that we'll be able to do once we know that these codes are permanent and we know that this isn't going away anytime. But certainly there's a lot more availability of government support, and there's a lot more indications from the government that this is a direction that they're going in permanently. We've also heard a lot of word from the government that things like access to therapy and other modalities of care that may not be seeing a physician, that there may be some support on the way for that as well. So I think that's really, really critical, because I think one of the difficulties we face in healthcare right now is that it's fully paid for by OHIP for you to see a doctor. But when that doctor says, okay, I think you need to see a therapist, a lot of people, especially those people who don't have a good benefits plan or may not be employed right now due to economic difficulties, they can't afford to see a therapist. And so what we're seeing is the very most vulnerable people in society are the people that have no help available to them. So I think it's something that I'm excited to hear more about. I have heard indications that there may be more support along those lines for mental health care for those without private benefits. But again, right now, nothing firm, but our fingers are crossed that there's going to be more of that.
Yeah, I hope so. From Jason here, we're basically glued to our screens now, and I find that I'm working more hours now than before the pandemic. Do you have any helpful tips on how I can find more work-life balance when I'm stuck at home?
It's a great question. And I don't know anybody who has an office type job who's working from home who is not experiencing that right now. So there's a few things that I would recommend. First of all, this is easier said than done, and it really does depend on your home situation. But it's important, if you have a home office, to separate where you do the work at home from the rest of your home activities. So there are many people that have set up their home offices in their kitchen, it's in their family room, it's in their bedroom. And the problem with that is that psychologically now, even when you're in your off time, you start to feel like you're at work because you're in the place that you do work. So if there is any part of your home or apartment that you can partition off, set up your home office and only go there when it's workplace hours, that's actually really helpful, because then when you get out of there, you actually feel like you've left work. Secondly, it is very easy when you're working from home to allow work to creep into all hours of the day and the weekends. And I think it's really important for anybody who's an employer on the line to, first of all, recognize that you can't do this to your employees and you shouldn't do this to your employees. You need to make it very clear with your employees that as of 5 p.m. or 6 p.m., depending on what your workplace is, you do not want to see your employees online. You want to see that they're out there and actually enjoying their lives and actually, taking care of themselves. And I think it's very important for employees, if your employer is not sending messages like this, you need to actually put your foot down and draw the line. You need to be very available, obviously, during work hours, but when it's the end of the workday, when it's 5 or 6 p.m. on a Wednesday or a Thursday, you need to pretend that the way things are going to happen is exactly the same as it is in the physical world, that you're walking out of the office. And when you turn that computer off, which you should turn your computer off, and probably I would actually advise almost turning your smartphone off as well, because that's a whole other way that people can reach us. But that's the equivalent of walking out the office door. And the same way that your employer wouldn't dream of calling you on your home phone at 8 p.m. to get you to do extra work, they shouldn't be trying to message you at 8 p.m. to get you to do extra work just because you're at home and everybody's online. And so that's the expectation that I think every employee should be setting and every employer should be setting as well. And I think don't be afraid to set these lines, because I think just a lot of us easily get carried away. Even, me being an employer, it's very easy for us to forget as an employer that just because somebody's at home doesn't mean they're available for work. So, our employees help us by reminding us of this and just set those firm lines that can't be crossed.
Yeah, and I agree. I mean, when I'm in front of my laptop all day, I try to tell myself to at least step away and go for a walk, or take a lunch break, because it's so easy to just keep going all day without even taking like a 5-10 minute break. So I think it's really important to
Yeah.
really shut down when you can.
And that's a great point that you make. And then this is actually one additional point I'll make is that many of us are doing Zoom calls, video calls all day long, and it may be Zoom or Teams or whatever we're on, but most of those calls actually don't have to be a video call. And that's what a lot of people are forgetting. So try as much as you can to convert your calls to phone calls where you're not needing to be on the screen, get off the screen. And many of my colleagues and myself included will do audio calls where we actually walk during the calls. I'll go out and I'll walk around my neighborhood while I'm on a call. And just taking that 1 hour call where you're walking will do tremendous good for your mental health and your physical health and will rejuvenate your day many of the times when you do it.
Yeah, there's this pressure of always being on screen, right? Like I've had some people be like, I can't see you. But when you're meeting new potential clients, and that's a different story. But yes, I mean, if we could walk and talk at the same time, then why not, right?
Yes.
Okay, so I have another question here from Stacy. Do you have any do you suggest pushing through? Wait, hang on. Also, I no longer like to go out if I can help it. Do you suggest pushing through that and doing it anyway, or allowing yourself to feel okay with holding up?
So my question is, are you somebody that enjoyed going out before the pandemic? Because, really the big question is this a big change in your behavior? Now, if you're somebody who never liked going out in the first place and now you're feeling a pressure to go out because of changing circumstances, that's probably not anything to worry about. But if you're the kind of person that really enjoyed going out and was very active walking around in the community or stepping outside, and now this is something that you're not doing, this is where it goes into one of the things I was speaking about during the presentation, which is you find that you're not doing things that you used to enjoy. And so that's when I say this is something to be concerned about, because there's no question that if this is something that you enjoy and you're not doing it, it's going to take a toll on you. And so I do recommend pushing through it, but I don't recommend just trying to do that on your own, because there probably are reasons why you're not doing it. And if you don't address it in the right way, you could actually make yourself more anxious. You could cause panic attacks or all sorts of other things. So if you look online, there are lots of resources for dealing with these kinds of issues. So fear of going outside or how to get over a specific fear. There's lots of online resources that will tell you how to sort of gradually increase the level of breaking through this and how to do it in a way that's safe and effective and isn't going to trigger side effects for you. Some of those things like ICBT I mentioned actually can be very helpful for this as well. So what I would recommend is absolutely do not ignore this. This is, I would say, almost a warning sign of something that if you ignore, things could get worse. But don't do it alone. Make sure that you have a really good plan and lots of tools that you're using to make sure that you get through this in a healthy way.
Okay, great. Frontina, can you speak more about the extent of medical care a patient can expect from Maple, as well as the limitations currently of what Maple doctors can and are not able to do?
Thank you for that question. So what we've seen, and this is a really interesting thing over the course of the pandemic, what we've seen is that there is a very, very broad variety of medical issues that can be addressed online. And I think a lot of patients and a lot of providers before the pandemic didn't actually either believe in virtual care or didn't really understand what you could do with virtual care. So there was this belief that if a doctor didn't actually physically put a hand on me, there's no way that doctor could diagnose things like a urinary tract infection or a throat infection. And so what we've seen during the pandemic, where we're seeing lots of appointments by video and lots of appointments by secure messaging, et cetera, is that actually most of the time the doctor does not need to lay a physical hand on you. So when we think about, for instance, if you have a throat infection, the doctor can easily take a look at a picture of the back of your throat that you've uploaded to a virtual consultation and very quickly decide if it's a throat infection just as effectively as if they were looking in your throat in the office. If you injured your limb and you were wondering, have I sprained my wrist or have I broken my wrist? Everything that you would do in the doctor's office in terms of, looking at it, looking at that wrist to see, is it swollen? Is it moving normally? Is it red? Is there openings in the skin? Are you tender in certain spots? Almost all of that can actually be walked through during a virtual examination. And the doctors online can order tests. So if the doctor, based on that, said you need an x-ray of your wrist, they can actually order an x-ray of your wrist. If we're worried about a urinary tract infection, the doctors can order a urine sample to be done. And many of the times when we see a patient in the office where we suspect that they have a urinary tract infection, a lot of the time what we will do is start treatment and then potentially order urinary tests after the fact, only if it's not getting better. That's a lot of the time the standard medical practice. So What we've seen, when you bring this all together, is that about 70% of the common things that people go to the doctor for can actually be addressed online. You don't need to have that physical touch. Now, there are some things that we can't do. So if somebody needs a actual procedure done, so you have a cut that needs to be stitched, we haven't figured out how to do that one online yet. If you have an internal examination of some sort that needs to be done, obviously without very specialized tools, you cannot do internal examination online. So there are some things that we can't do, but the vast majority of things actually can be dealt with. And the good thing about most online services, including ours, is that there's what's called a triaging tool built in. So if you wanted to see a doctor on our platform, you would submit your request and the doctors would look at it. And if they felt that they couldn't help you, they would just click a button to say, sorry, this isn't something that's appropriate for virtual care. You need to be seen in person. And you'd get that message before you even saw the doctor, and you wouldn't waste your time. And the typical wait time to get a message like that to find out is about a minute or a minute and a half. So it's not like you're waiting an hour to figure out, can I see a doctor online? You're basically finding out immediately. So it's not like there's a lot you're going to lose. So short answer is, I would say for those people who are contemplating a virtual visit, give it a shot. Worst case scenario is you'll waste a couple minutes of your life and the doctor will tell you to go to a clinic. Best case scenario, you will save many hours and a trip to the clinic and all of the things about a clinic that we don't like.
And then do they have access to your doctors like throughout, the holidays, let's say, like around Christmas, around like long weekends? I know it's always been tough to go in like a walk-in clinic, for example, during the holidays. So do we have like access, 24/7? Is this something that's doable?
Yeah, it depends on the platform. So on our platform, Maple, it is 24/7 across the country. So be it Christmas, be it New Year's Day, if it's 2 a.m, doesn't really matter. The platform always operates. And, if you go back in time as to why we started the platform, the main reason why we started, and we did this way before the pandemic began, but we started this platform because we knew that it was very hard for people to get access to doctors. And specifically, we knew that it was very hard for people to get access to doctors after hours. So if you spoke to Canadians, one of their biggest challenges was that there was nowhere to go if it was 7 p.m. other than the emergency room, or nowhere to go, especially in the middle of the night. So we really wanted to solve for that. And that's why the platform operates the way that it does.
That's great. I have another question here from Andrew. Do you recommend putting down social media casual device use at a certain time as well?
100%. Yeah. So it's been well demonstrated through lots of research that, never mind the time of day, social media in general is generally not good for your mental health. So there is a direct correlation between the number of hours that you spend on social media in your week and the negative effects it has on your mental health. So feelings of depression and anxiety tend to go up with more social media use. Sleep disturbance tends to go up. Many other issues tend to worsen in terms of mental health when we see more social media usage. So as a whole, what I would say is anybody who is experiencing problems with mental health, one of the first things that you should do is try to cut back on social media. It's an addiction like any other addiction. So just like alcohol or drug use, it's something that needs to be cut back because it is harmful. Secondly, device usage late in the evenings is very much known to be one of those things that interferes with our ability to sleep. So if you have devices on, and you'll hear varying advice on what time you should put them away, but typically what we say is after 9 or 10 p.m. is the line. So if you have devices on after 9 or 10 p.m., there's a number of reasons why they will interfere with your sleep. They'll interfere with your sleep because of there are some theories around the kind of light that they generate, that is something that tricks our brain into believing that it's not actually nighttime. They also interfere with our sleep because typically this is a period of time in the day when our thoughts tend to calm naturally and we don't have a lot of circulating thoughts. And it typically is the time when it is easiest for us to close our eyes and naturally drift away. But what social media does when you start to look at it, and by social media, I don't just mean looking at Facebook and Twitter, or your Instagram. It's any of the social media apps that give you a news feed of current events. You don't want to be looking at the news at 10 or 11 either. Same thing. What it does is it gets your mind circulating. It takes you from that natural calm state that you would have in the evenings into a state where you have a heightened sense of thinking, a heightened pace of thinking, which is the exact opposite of what we want before bedtime. So overall, decrease social media, and certainly after 9 or 10 in the evening, put it all away. Put all your devices away.
And then to this point too, can you speak to suggestions for assisting preteens with surging hormones, but possibly COVID depression?
Well, that's certainly a difficult one. Managing preteens with surging hormones in the best of times is a big challenge. So I really hand it to anybody that's dealing with this or dealt with this in the past or is going to be dealing with this. It's a really big challenge. And a lot of it is just due to the fact that, teenage years with or without hormonal changes are very difficult. It's a difficult time for most of them. Their bodies are changing, their responsibilities are changing. And then when you add in things like hormonal changes and you add in things like COVID on top of it, now it becomes a very, very difficult mix to deal with. And so I think, there's a number of things that I would advise. So first of all, it's really important, as much as you possibly can, to try to have a transparent dialogue with your teen. I think a lot of people tend to either not openly express their concerns to their teen or not have a place where their teen can actually express their concerns to them. So the more open that dialogue is between parents and teens, the more able you're going to be to help them. Now, that's obviously easier said than done, but certainly not rushing to judgment when they ever tell you about something that's happening is really important. So what we typically find with teens is if they open up about a problem, potentially a concern around sexual activity or drinking or any of these other things, many parents will give them trouble. And that's the quickest way to shut down discourse in that relationship. And then you won't ever have open dialogue. So the key is, if they ever open up to you about these kinds of things that are troubling them, try not to be judgmental, try not to rush to giving them trouble, because this is how you're going to be able to keep them speaking to and opening up about their issues. So have that open dialogue. Secondly, what you want to do with your teens is very much what you want to do with any adult. So, I look at teens, despite all of what I just said, they're really small adults. They're adults that just aren't fully grown, and they have many of the same health conditions that adults have, and many of the same presentations. So if you look at those lists that I went through earlier in the presentation, all the things to look out for, you want to screen for those with your teens. You want to ask them about things like their sleep. You want to ask them, about alcohol use. You want to ask them, are they having any of these other things that we look at for panic attacks? So chest pains and palpitations and shortness of breath and headaches and tension in their muscles and all those things. And, obviously it's a little bit difficult to work into natural conversation, but you can do this. So you want to be asking the questions, not just that direct question, are you feeling stressed or anxious? Because many teens will never admit that to you, but ask them all the other questions around what they might be feeling to clue you in. And then finally, I think, obviously, once you realize or suspect that there's a problem, my biggest advice when it comes to managing teens who are having these issues is do not try to manage this on your own. It is hard enough for a trained mental health therapist to work with teens and to get them to, speak openly about their issues and to come up with coping mechanisms. And these are trained therapists who have worked on this for years. And what I would say is I never, ever would expect that any parent would have those same abilities or hone those abilities to the same level that any therapist has. So my advice is, once you recognize it, have the discussion with the teen about how you've started to worry about them and try to start bringing in resources. So if you want to set up virtual therapy appointments for your teen, or have them using apps like the Headspace app or whatever it is that's out there that is a professional tool that you can use, this is one of the most important things to do, which is don't try to be the therapist yourself to the teen, because invariably, A, you're not skilled enough to do it, and B, your relationship with the teen will interfere with the ability to have an objective, helpful conversation.
Those are very helpful tips. Thank you. And then here, can Maple refer a patient to OHIP covered specialists?
So we do in some areas, but not broadly yet. So we have a lot of work that we do with private insurers and large employers, et cetera. And so for anybody who uses our service where they access us through one of the big insurers that we work with, we do have a whole navigational service in the background that will actually recommend patients and set up specialist referrals in the OHIP system for patients. That's something that we're looking to expand in the future. It's a really difficult service to run, because what we try to do is when people are referred to a specialist, we work really hard to find them specialists that are available, that are taking patients, that we can refer them to and get them in relatively quickly. And that's one of the things that I want to be able to create for our patient population at large. So us just making referrals that are, typically when you look at public system referrals where the wait can be 6 to 12 months, I don't think that that's a really helpful thing for us to do. I think just giving somebody a referral where they're going to be back in a very, very long queue is not helpful. And so where I'd like us to go is a place where we can actually make availability of specialists much better for everybody. And so part of that will be OHIP system specialists in the physical world, but part of what we'd really like to do is add more and more OHIP covered specialists right inside of our app, so that if you need to see a psychiatrist, we'll have an OHIP covered psychiatrist that is right on the app. So we can get you seen very quickly by a video appointment, and you don't have to pay anything for it. So there's a lot of things that we're doing in the background to get there. It's not easy going, and some of it will rely on permanent funding to come from the government. But I definitely, I would say this is where we want to go. We want to make all forms of healthcare, not just, general practitioner visits, but all forms of healthcare, including specialist care, very much more accessible than it has ever been.
Great. One last question here. So how does Maple source its doctors?
It's a great question. For the most part, we've been very lucky in that we've had an incredible amount of interest from doctors to work on our platform. And it started from the beginning because my background, I'm an emergency room physician. And so in the early days of operating our platform, the first doctors on the platform were myself and about 6 of my emergency room colleagues. And that was it. So if you were coming onto Maple, you would see either me or one of my colleagues. And what happened over time as we got busier is my colleagues from my emergency room that were working on the platform started to say, this is really great. And I like working on this platform, and started to recommend it to other colleagues. And then they recommended it to other colleagues, and so on and so forth, to the point where we now have a wait list of about 600 physicians across Canada that are waiting to join the platform. And we add them on bit by bit as we get bigger and bigger. Right now, we have about a million or so patients on the platform. And by the end of 2020, we anticipate we'll have somewhat over 2 million patients on the platform, because we're actually adding on a whole bunch of extra programs over the last few months of the year. And so we'll be adding on a lot of those physicians. But the nice thing for us is that it's all been word of mouth. It's been word of mouth from our existing physicians to new physicians. And then when they get referred, we put those new physicians through a very comprehensive screening and onboarding process to make sure that, you know, their credentials are good, to make sure that they're joining for the right reasons. We train them in virtual care because most doctors aren't trained in virtual care in their regular medical school training. In my medical school, we never learned anything about how to examine a patient by video. So we make sure that we can teach those skills. But we have been very, very fortunate in terms of all of the interest that we've had from doctors to come to our platform and to work on our platform.
Okay, that's amazing. Well, thank you so much for your time today, Dr. Belchetz. This was so insightful. It was really great, very informative. So thank you so much for your time. And thank you everyone for joining us today. I hope you enjoy the rest of your day, and we'll be in touch soon. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.